The dog stopped barking first. On the morning of October 7, 1863, 3 bloodhounds trained to track runaways through the thick swamps of the Yazoo Basin refused to cross the property line of the Thornton plantation in Warren County, Mississippi. Their handler, a man named Silas Creed, who had been tracking fugitives for 11 years, watched his animals whine and crouch low, pressing their bellies into the wet mud. Something in the shadowy cypress groves marked this land as forbidden, something the dogs instinctively recognized. By sunset, Creed would be dead. His body was found floating face down in the black, still water, rope burns around his ankles hinting that he had been dragged. No one could explain the strange pattern of puncture wounds along his spine. Yet the enslaved people working the cotton fields just 2 miles east knew exactly what had happened. They had a name for the thing that moved through those swamps, a name spoken only after the overseers had gone to bed. They called him Black Mamba. And he was just beginning. The slaver ship Elizabeth docked in New Orleans on March 14, 1859, carrying 207 human beings chained in its hold. Among them was a young man from the Ashanti region, about 17 years old, who would never speak his birth name to any white person who claimed ownership over him. The ship's manifest listed him simply as male, healthy, warrior marks. Those marks, ritual scars across his shoulders and chest, told a story the slavers could not read. He had been a scout for his village, trained from childhood to move silently through dense forest, read tracks, and set traps for leopards or rival raiders. When European slavers attacked his village at dawn, burning huts and chaining survivors, he fought until a rifle butt cracked his skull. He woke in darkness in chains in the Elizabeth's hold. The Middle Passage lasted 63 days. 41 people died before landfall during those days. The young Ashanti warrior learned a lesson that would shape everything he did afterward. He learned that silence was survival, that careful observation was strategy, and that the moment you stopped paying attention was the moment you gave up. He memorized the sailors' routines, which planks creaked most loudly, which hatches opened easily, which crew hesitated when distributing the meager rations. Every detail went into a mind built to hold maps, patrol schedules, and eventually, the exact timing and strike of a cottonmouth. At the New Orleans slave market on Barron Street, a Mississippi planter named Robert Thornton purchased him for $800. Thornton owned 700 acres of cotton along the Big Black River worked by 93 enslaved people, and he needed strong hands for the harvest. The Ashanti warrior was renamed Jake, a simple, forgettable name, and was taken upriver in chains to Warren County. The journey lasted 4 days. Jake did not speak once. He studied the landscape as it slid past, noting the curves of the river, the density of the cypress groves, where the current ran fast, and where still eddies formed, perfect for hiding. The overseer at the Thornton plantation was a North Carolina man named Virgil Cass, 38 years old, known for efficiency and cruelty in equal measure. Cass met each new slave with the same speech, pacing in front of the assembled field hands. 3 rules here. Work hard. Don't run. Don't cause trouble. Break 1 rule, you get the lash. Break 2 rules, you get sold downriver. Break 3 rules, you die. He paused before Jake, eyes fixed on the ritual scars. You look like you might be trouble. Prove me wrong. Jake's expression remained unreadable, giving nothing back. The cotton fields stretched endlessly, rose so straight they seemed to vanish at the horizon. Work was punishing, stooping from dawn until dusk, fingers bleeding from the sharp cotton bolls, back screaming from endless bending. Jake worked quietly, efficiently, speaking rarely. Other enslaved workers noticed the stillness he carried, the way he occupied space without claiming it. A woman named Esther, born on the plantation and a natural leader among the field hands, observed him closely. "You understand English?" she asked one evening after the work bell rang. "Yes," Jake said softly. "Where are you from?" "Across the water." "Any family left?" "None." Esther nodded. Everyone here had lost someone. She did not press further but noted how Jake watched everything, the guards' rotations, the sun's position, how the wind shifted before rain. He was always planning, even if no one yet knew for what. The incident with the cottonmouth occurred on a Saturday in late June 1859. The field hands were clearing brush near the river when a scream pierced the air. A cottonmouth, thick as a man's forearm and nearly 4 feet long, had slithered from the undergrowth and struck at a young boy named Samuel. It missed narrowly and coiled on the bare earth, mouth open, body vibrating in warning. The workers scattered. Cass raised his rifle, but Jake moved faster, stepping forward in one smooth motion, catching the snake behind the head with his left hand, while his right hand seized the tail. The cottonmouth writhed violently, but Jake held firm. There was a wet crack as vertebrae broke. The snake went limp. Jake dropped it into the dirt and returned to work, silent as before. That evening Esther found him near the slave quarters. "Where'd you learn that?" "Different snakes where I'm from. Same principle." Jake looked at her for the first time. "Running only works if you know where you're going." The story spread through the quarters that night, growing with each retelling. By morning, younger field hands had started calling him Mamba, after the deadly African snake from tales passed down through generations. Black Mambas moved faster than a man could react, struck without warning, and their bite meant death. The name fit. Jake did not discourage it. A reputation could be useful if wielded carefully. But the name drew attention from the Thorntons. Robert Thornton's eldest son, Marcus, 24, educated in law at the University of Virginia and Board of Plantation Management, heard the story from Cass. The African killed the snake with his bare hands. That's what the field hands say. Marcus smiled slowly. He had been looking for entertainment. Marcus had learned to ride and shoot before he could read. He had hunted deer, boar, and bear across 3 states, but animals were predictable, bound by territory, limited by instinct. A man, though, a man trained as a warrior, who killed a cottonmouth without flinching, that would be a sport worthy of the name. He proposed the idea to his father over dinner in August 1859. A hunting game. Give the African a head start into the swamp. We track him on horseback with dogs. If we catch him, we bring him back. No harm done, just exercise. Robert Thornton frowned. "You mean to chase my property through dangerous swamps for fun? I propose to train him. A slave who knows he cannot escape is a slave who will not try. Cass and 4 armed men will be there. He won't make it a mile." Robert considered it. His son's restlessness had been a problem. Better to channel it into something controlled than let it turn to gambling or dueling. No injuries. "I need him for the harvest." Marcus grinned. "Of course." The first hunt took place on a Sunday afternoon in late August. Jake was brought to the edge of the plantation where open fields met swamp. Marcus explained the rules from horseback, rifle across his saddle. "You run. We count to 100, then we come after you. If you reach the old Sinclair place," he pointed northwest toward ruins barely visible through the trees, "you win. We let you rest tomorrow. If we catch you, double work tomorrow, understand?" Jake looked at the swamp, then back at Marcus, expression unreadable. "Yes, sir. Good. Start running." Jake did not run. He walked deliberately into the cypress shadows. Marcus laughed and began counting aloud. At 100, he signaled the dogs. They lunged forward, baying. The hunters followed at a canter, confident in their superiority, numbers, weapons, local knowledge. They found Jake's trail quickly enough: broken branches, disturbed mud, boot prints heading northwest. But after a quarter mile the trail split, then split again. The dogs became confused, circling back. Cass dismounted, squinting at the tracks. His doubling back, laying false paths, then following the real one. Marcus snapped. "That's the problem, they all look real." They found Jake 2 hours later, sitting calmly on a fallen log near the Sinclair ruins. He had beaten them and waited. Marcus, sweating and irritated, stared down from his horse. "How?" "I ran fast, sir," Jake said, lying. He had memorized the terrain weeks before, mapped the quickest route, and created false trails in minutes using techniques his people used to confuse leopards. There was no need to explain tactics to a man who saw him only as property. Marcus rode away angry but would return. The hunt had proven too entertaining to abandon after one try. The hunts became weekly events. From August 1859 to April 1860, Marcus organized 19 hunts. Each time Jake received a head start. Each time he did not try to escape but to map. The Yazoo Basin swamps stretched across hundreds of square miles, a maze of black water, cypress knees, and shifting channels that could drown anyone unfamiliar with the solid paths. Jake turned himself into a living map, learning high ground, stayed safe during floods, Hollow trees that could hide food, narrow water paths deep enough to move quietly at night. He marked signs that only someone who knew the land would notice. A lightning-split oak, a tight group of river cane, a sandbar curved like a half-moon. The other enslaved people noticed how he returned every Sunday. He always came back soaked, scraped, worn out. Esther began setting food aside for him. Cornbread wrapped in cloth, dried meat, a clay jug filled with water. She never asked him anything. Some things were better left unsaid. But one evening after the 16th hunt, she saw him sitting outside the quarters slowly scraping mud from his boots. "You learning anything out there?" "Yes, Mom." "You planning to use it?" "Not yet, why not?" Jake glanced toward the big house where light shone through the windows. "Because running alone just gets you killed alone. Better to wait until running has meaning." Esther knew that one escape was a personal win. An organized stand was something bigger. But something bigger needed planning, and planning needed time. During this time, Jake slowly changed how the others saw him. He taught a few people he trusted simple tracking skills: how to read turned soil, how to walk without snapping sticks, how to erase tracks by dragging pine branches behind you. He never said it was for escape. He framed it as hunting skills, like they were only learning how to catch rabbits for extra food. If the overseers noticed, they saw nothing strange, just slaves improving their meals. They did not see a system taking shape. Jake also studied the plantation's people the same way he studied the swamp. He learned who could be trusted, who would betray others for extra food, who had family ties that could be used against them. He memorized guard shifts, supply days, and the pattern of Robert Thornton's trips to Vicksburg. He noticed that Cass drank too much on Saturday nights and moved slow on Sunday mornings. He saw that the gunpowder was kept in a shed near the stables, locked with nothing more than a simple lock. Every detail was stored in his mind, waiting. The white people on the plantation knew nothing. Robert Thornton saw a quiet slave who worked hard and caused no trouble. Marcus saw a clever runner who made Sundays fun. The overseers saw another African who knew his place. Even nearby planters, hearing about the hunts, laughed about them instead of worrying. Young Thornton's got himself a smart one, they'd say over whiskey in a Vicksburg parlor. Keeps him busy, I guess. But if you were one of them, what would you really see? A game or a man being trained to survive by the people who owned him? The first patrol dog vanished in November of 1859. The dog was a mixed tracking hound named Brutus, owned by a local patrol that enforced slave laws across Warren County. The patrol was made up of 5 white men allowed by the state to search for runaways and enforce curfews. They used Brutus to scare field hands during their rounds. The dog was cruel, trained to attack on command, a weapon with teeth. One Wednesday evening, Brutus disappeared while the patrol was checking passes near the Big Black River. His handler searched for hours before finding the body floating in shallow water. His neck was snapped clean. There were no signs of a fight. The patrol blamed a bear. Bears sometimes came up from Louisiana and a large one could kill a dog. But Esther, hearing the story from a house slave who overheard the patrol, looked at Jake and stayed silent. He was fixing a harness, hands busy with the leather, his face far away. He did not explain, he did not need to. The second patrol dog disappeared in January of 1860. This time the body was found on dry ground, placed carefully at the base of a cypress tree, surrounded by broken sticks laid in a pattern that looked deliberate. The patrol grew nervous. 2 dogs gone in 2 months was not normal. Handlers began moving in pairs and kept their dogs on leashes even in open land. The 3rd dog vanished in March. This time, people said they saw something moving through the trees near the patrol. A shadow that flowed like water and was gone before anyone could focus. They chased it but found only tracks that led into the swamp and ended at the water. The dog was never found. Stories spread among the white people of Warren County. Some said a panther had moved in. Others whispered about darker things. A swamp spirit, a curse, a restless ghost. The enslaved people said nothing aloud, but among themselves they understood. Black Mamba was teaching the patrol fear. Jake had spent months studying patrol routes, learning their favorite paths and busiest times. The dogs were their strongest tool. Remove the dogs and the patrol weakened. He set traps where the dogs would sniff, used scent bait to draw them away from their handlers, and killed them quickly and cleanly, the same way he killed the snake. Each death was meant to increase fear while leaving no proof of a man's hand. Let them believe it was an animal. Let them believe it was something unseen. Fear worked best when no one knew its source. By April of 1860, the Warren County Patrol had lost 5 dogs in 6 months. They stopped bringing animals on their rounds. This forced them to rely only on sight, which was useless in thick brush. Runaways from nearby plantations noticed the change. More people tried to flee. Most were caught, but the attempts increased. The system was cracking. Marcus Thornton mentioned the missing dogs during one Sunday hunt. Cass thinks something's killing patrol dogs in the swamp. Says it could be a big cat. He looked at Jake, who stood at the starting place waiting for the count. You seen anything strange out there? No, sir, Jake said. Just trees and water. Marcus studied him for a long moment, then smiled. Well, if you see a panther, don't try to fight it. I'd hate to lose my best runner. Yes, sir, the count started. Jake slipped into the swamp. Marcus never guessed that his favorite game was sharpening the most dangerous man in Warren County. Wesley Creed made his living capturing runaway slaves. He had done it for 16 years, working from Virginia to Louisiana, and he was good at it. Careful, patient, and completely unmoved by suffering. He charged by the mile, 20 cents for each mile traveled, plus expenses. In a good year he could earn $800, more than many farmers. When he came to Warren County in June of 1860, answering a request from a planter who had lost 3 slaves to the swamp, Creed brought his reputation and his tools, manacles, leg irons, and a leather whip woven with wire. He also brought his younger brother Silas, less skilled but learning. The Creed brothers set up camp at the western edge of the Thornton plantation where the swamp began. They questioned locals, reviewed sightings, and started tracking. They found signs. Turned soil, broken limbs, proof that someone moved there often. Silas thought it might be several fugitives sharing paths. Wesley knew better. This wasn't careless movement, he said. This was someone who knew the land completely. What they didn't know was that Jake had been watching since the first day. He saw their camp, studied how they tracked, learned their habits. He knew they were professionals in a real danger. They needed a warning that could not be ignored. Jake waited until the brothers split up. Wesley went north along a strong trail. Silas went south beside a creek. Jake followed Silas, silent, staying downwind. Silas was young and careless. He whistled as he walked, sure of himself. That confidence ended when Jake stepped from the brush 20 yards behind him. Making sure to be heard, Silas spun, hand on his pistol. Who's there? Jake stood still and said nothing. He let Silas see him clearly. The scars, the calm, the total lack of fear. It was done on purpose. Silas could shoot, but the noise would bring Wesley, and Jake would be gone. Or Silas could retreat and spread fear. Silas backed away with his gun raised, never breaking eye contact until the brush stopped him. Then he ran. An hour later he found his brother and told him what happened, his voice shaking. He just stood there. Didn't say a word, like he was waiting for me to make a mistake. Wesley frowned. You sure he wasn't armed? Positive. But that wasn't the point. He didn't need a weapon. You should have seen his eyes. That night, Jake came close to their camp. The brothers sat by a fire eating salt pork and cornbread. Jake crept within 30 feet, close enough to hear them, close enough that a skilled woodsman would sense him. He wanted them to feel watched. He wanted them to understand they were no longer the hunters. The hunters were spent, soaked, scratched, and breathing heavily. Marcus cursed under his breath, realizing the pursuit had already turned against them. Jake wasn't hiding to escape. He was teaching them exactly how powerless they were in this swamp. Every wrong turn, every exhausted step, every misjudged waterway was part of the lesson. He had made the swamp his ally, each tree, each channel, each patch of mud a tool against them. By late afternoon, Marcus's group was broken. 2 more men had fallen behind, too tired to continue. The remaining 4 were moving cautiously, knowing mistakes could be fatal. Marcus's frustration grew into panic. He glanced around constantly, trying to anticipate Jake's next move, but the man ahead remained invisible, always out of sight, controlling every aspect of the chase. Then Jake struck again. He had positioned himself near a narrow inlet where the hunters would have to navigate carefully. Using the last of his reserves, he created a noise far off to the right, branches snapping, leaves rustling, a faint splash. Marcus and his men immediately veered toward it, thinking he was there. By the time they realized the deception, they had wasted precious energy and time, and Jake had moved quietly to the opposite side of the swamp. Already several hundred yards ahead, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Marcus's party was completely disoriented. They had been chasing shadows, overestimating every sound, every disturbance. Marcus finally admitted the truth aloud, though only to himself. This wasn't about catching a man anymore. This was about surviving the swamp. Jake, high on a ridge overlooking the main channel, paused to rest briefly. His breathing was controlled, his mind alert, his body ready. He had allowed the hunters to exhaust themselves and teach themselves the lesson of his dominance. The swamp, once an obstacle, was now a weapon. By the time darkness approached, he had put miles and miles between himself and the pursuers, leaving them trapped in confusion, exhaustion, and fear. That night, under the dim light of the rising moon, Jake camped briefly on a small patch of high ground, completely hidden from view. The stories about Black Mamba had never been more accurate. He wasn't just surviving, he was asserting control, reinforcing the myth, and ensuring the swamp itself seemed alive and sentient to anyone who dared enter it. The hunters would remember this day for the rest of their lives, if they survived it at all, and every tale they told would grow in terror and reverence. By dawn, Marcus and the remaining men were barely able to navigate back to the edge of the swamp. Their faces were pale, their clothes torn, and their pride shattered. They had underestimated one man, underestimated the land, underestimated the power of patience and cunning. Jake, meanwhile, had already vanished into the dense forest, a shadow among shadows, waiting for the next test, the next challenge, the next opportunity to make the swamp speak in his voice. The legend continued to grow, as unstoppable as the river itself. Every whispered story of Black Mamba became a warning, a thrill, a proof that some forces, some men, and some places could not be conquered, not by numbers, not by fire, not by fear. And Jake, always a step ahead, maintained the delicate balance between myth and reality, ensuring that no one could ever truly tame the swamp or him. If you want, I can continue rewriting the next part of the story with the same style, keeping it longer than the original and adding subtle shifts in word choice and rhythm to make it feel fresh, but entirely faithful to the original. Do you want me to do that? 2 more hunters had dropped out, turning back toward the plantation with tired steps. Marcus, Cass, and 3 others kept pushing forward, faces set and grim. By the 9th hour, Jake decided he had proven his point. It was time to end this in a way that left no doubt. Anyone who tried to chase him through the swamps needed to understand that it meant death. He had planned for this exact moment. Near a place where 2 water channels met, he had spent weeks building a trap. It was a heavy net made from twisted vines, hidden high in the cypress branches and connected to a thin tripwire. Jake guided the hunters straight toward it without them realizing. Cass stepped forward and triggered the wire. The net fell instantly, wrapping around Cass and another hunter. The thick cords weighted with stones. They slammed to the ground, yelling and struggling as the weight pinned them down. Marcus spun around, lifting his rifle, but Jake was already gone, slipping into the brush like smoke fading into air. The 3 remaining hunters spent nearly 20 minutes cutting their men free. When they finally pulled Cass out, his arms and face were covered in scratches, blood running from several cuts. He was shaking with anger and exhaustion. "I'm not dying in this swamp for your pride," he snapped at Marcus. "We're leaving now." Marcus wanted to argue, but when he looked at the others he saw fear and total fatigue. They had been hunting for 10 hours. Their clothes were soaked, their skin torn by thorns, their stomachs empty, and they had no idea where they were. Their horses were gone. Night would arrive in a few hours, and none of them wanted to be trapped in the swamp after dark. "Fine," Marcus said at last, his jaw tight. "But this isn't finished." They dragged themselves back toward the plantation and arrived just before sunset. Jake was already there, sitting outside the slave quarters, calmly eating cornbread that Esther had saved for him. He looked up as Marcus rode past on a borrowed horse. Their eyes met. In that moment, Marcus felt a cold twist in his stomach. What he saw was not defiance or hatred. It was simple understanding. Things had changed. Marcus still controlled Jake's legal status, but Jake controlled the swamps, and that was where real power lived. That night, Marcus sat in his father's study and made a firm decision. "We need to sell him," he said. "I don't care what it costs. He's too dangerous to keep." Robert, who had listened quietly to the entire story, shook his head. "He's also the most valuable piece of property on this plantation. He works hard, causes no trouble here, and you're saying he's dangerous only when you chase him into land where he has every advantage. The solution is simple. Stop chasing him." Marcus argued that Jake was organizing resistance out there and mentioned Bly's concerns, but Robert waved it off. "Speculation. There's no proof." He poured whiskey into 2 glasses and slid one across the desk. "Besides, bigger things are coming. Have you been watching the political situation? Lincoln is likely to win in November. If he does, South Carolina will leave the Union. War is coming, Marcus. When it does, we'll have much bigger problems than one clever slave." Marcus wanted to push back, but he knew his father was right. The country was coming apart. Personal grudges had to wait. He drank his whiskey and said nothing more about Jake. But he did not forget, and when war finally arrived, Marcus promised himself he would get his revenge. The hunt never happened again. Abraham Lincoln won the presidency on November 6, 1860. South Carolina seceded on December 20th. Mississippi followed on January 9, 1861. By April, the Confederacy had formed and opened fire on Fort Sumter. The war that had been building for decades finally exploded into open fighting. Warren County sent its young men to battle, farmers' sons, planters' sons, overseers, all forming militia units that drilled in courthouse squares before marching off to Virginia. Marcus Thornton joined the 17th Mississippi Infantry as a lieutenant. His father stayed behind to manage the plantation, but with most able-bodied white men gone, control became harder every month. Cass enlisted as well, leaving the plantation without its most feared overseer. His replacement, an older man named Phelps, lacked Cass's cruelty and control. The war changed everything. Cotton prices collapsed as Union ships blocked southern ports. Food grew scarce as farms were forced to feed the Confederate Army. The plantation system, which depended on constant violence and supervision, began to weaken under the strain. Enslaved people across Mississippi noticed the shift. Some ran away. Others slowed their work, knowing punishment was harder to enforce. A few, like Jake, waited and prepared. Jake's position on the Thornton plantation changed during the first year of the war. With Cass gone and Phelps ineffective, Jake was given more responsibility. He supervised work crews, managed tools, and organized daily labor. Robert Thornton saw this as a practical choice. Jake saw it as a chance to build something bigger. He reached out to enslaved people on nearby plantations, creating a communication network using trusted messengers who traveled under the excuse of plantation errands. News moved quietly through this system. Which Confederate units were nearby, which patrols had stopped running, which white families were struggling. Jake remembered everything, slowly building a detailed picture of how the war was affecting the region. In the spring of 1862, reports began to reach Warren County about Union forces moving along the Mississippi River. General Ulysses S. Grant was driving south, cutting Confederate supply lines. The Tennessee River fell, then the Cumberland. By April, Union gunboats were shelling Memphis. The war, once distant, was getting close. Robert Thornton read the Vicksburg newspapers with growing worry. "If they take the river, we're cut off from everything," he said. He was right. By July of 1862, Union forces controlled most of the river north of Vicksburg. The Confederacy held Vicksburg and the stretch down to Port Hudson, but barely. Union raids into Mississippi became common. Cavalry units swept through the countryside, stealing supplies, freeing enslaved people, and tearing up roads and rails. The enslaved population heard these stories and understood what they meant. Freedom was getting closer. Jake began preparing for the moment when action would be possible. He quietly gathered supplies, food, tools, and weapons taken little by little from the plantation's shrinking stores. He mapped routes that groups could use, not just lone runners. He figured out who on nearby plantations would be willing to fight, not only escape. He was building something organized, not random. And then he waited. The chance came in November of 1862. A Confederate supply depot sat near the Big Black River, 12 miles east of the Thornton plantation. It held food, ammunition, and medical supplies meant for troops in Tennessee. It was guarded by a single militia company, boys too young and men too old for real battle. The depot depended on distance, not strength, for protection. No one expected an attack there. Jake did, and he would not be alone. He spent months choosing people carefully. 23 men and 7 women from 5 different plantations, all personally tested, all ready to risk everything. They met in the swamps on the cold night of November 7, 1862, when white families stayed indoors by their fires. Jake drew a map in the mud with a stick and explained the plan. The depot is here. 2 guards outside, maybe 4 inside. We go at midnight when they're tired. We take the weapons first, then food and medicine, then we burn what's left. A man named Thomas asked what everyone was thinking. And after that, where do we go? North, Jake said. We move through the swamps where patrols can't follow. We hit Confederate supplies along the way and keep moving until we reach Union lines. Someone asked if the Union would accept them. They need scouts who know this land, Jake said. They need fighters. We give them both. He looked at every face. Once we do this, there's no going back. They'll hunt us. Some of us won't survive. Anyone who wants to leave, go now. No one moved. The raid began at midnight on November 8th. They moved quietly through the dark, coming in from the riverside where guards were careless. Jake went first, slipping over the fence and crossing open ground. 2 guards sat by a fire, talking softly. Jake came up behind them. What followed was fast and silent. No gunshots, no alarms. Within 5 minutes the guards were tied and gagged, and the group was inside. They found 12 rifles, ammunition, 3 pistols, barrels of salt pork, sacks of cornmeal, and medical supplies. They loaded what they could onto a stolen wagon and set fire to the rest. Cotton bales burned, wooden crates burned. The building itself went up in flames. By dawn, when Confederate troops arrived from Vicksburg, the depot was nothing but ashes. The raiders were gone, swallowed by the swamps, carrying enough supplies to fight for months. The attack shook Warren County. An organized strike by enslaved people against a Confederate supply depot had never happened before. Newspapers blamed outside agitators. Officials claimed Union spies were responsible. But Robert Thornton remembered Marcus's warnings. He went to the quarters and found Jake's cabin empty. Jake and 5 others were gone. Robert stood there, staring at the bare walls, finally understanding that his son had been right. The story of Black Mamba had turned into a military threat. Between November of 1862 and May of 1863, Jake's group carried out 17 attacks against Confederate targets across western Mississippi. They burned supply wagons, cut telegraph lines, ambushed small patrols, and freed enslaved people from abandoned plantations. Every action was planned with care, carried out cleanly, and left no one alive to identify who had struck. Confederate reaction was predictable, but ineffective. They increased patrols that couldn't navigate the swamps, offered bounties that no one could ever collect, and spread rhetoric blaming Northern interference instead of acknowledging the organized local resistance. The group grew steadily. Freed slaves joined willingly, bringing valuable local knowledge and practical skills. By March 1863, Jake led roughly 60 people operating out of camps hidden deep within the swamp. Their reputation grew to rival even Jake's personal legend. Confederate soldiers whispered nervously about the swamp devils, guerrillas who appeared out of nowhere, struck fiercely, and disappeared before any response could be mounted. The enslaved community spoke of Black Mamba's army, freedom fighters who proved that resistance was possible, but their success brought attention. In April 1863, the Confederate Army sent a full company of veteran troops to pacify the Yazoo Basin region. These were not inexperienced militia or tired patrol guards. These were battle-hardened men who had fought at Shiloh and Corinth and knew how to combat irregular forces. They brought tracker dogs, skilled scouts, and a ruthless leader, Captain William Strother, who had made his reputation hunting bushwhackers in Missouri. Strother announced his arrival with a proclamation posted in every town across Warren County. Any black person found with weapons would be executed immediately. Any white person aiding insurgents would be tried for treason. The lawlessness in this region would end now. Jake read the notice after one of his scouts returned from Vicksburg. He understood the warning clearly. The game had changed. The Confederacy was taking him seriously enough to commit real resources. He needed to adapt quickly. His plan came in two parts. First, he split his 60-person group into 6 smaller units that could operate independently. This made them harder to track and reduced the risk of losing everyone in one engagement. Second, he shifted strategy from direct attacks to intelligence gathering. Instead of raiding Confederate positions, his units began mapping them, noting troop numbers, supply lines, and weak points in defenses. This information would later prove invaluable to Union forces when they arrived in force. That arrival came sooner than Jake expected in May 1863. General Grant began his campaign to capture Vicksburg. Union forces advanced inland from the Mississippi River, cutting the city off from Confederate reinforcements. Battles erupted across Warren County at places like Champion Hill and the Big Black River Bridge, desperate clashes that killed hundreds and shattered Confederate defensive lines. In the chaos, Jake's teams passed intelligence directly to Union scouts, locations of artillery, supply depots, and headquarters. The information was devastatingly accurate. After one particularly valuable report, a Union major named Samuel Clark requested a personal meeting with Jake. They met in a clearing near the Big Black River, guarded by Union pickets. Clark studied Jake carefully. "I've heard stories about you. Black Mamba, they call you."
"Some of my men think you're a myth." "I'm real enough,"
Jake replied. "Then what do you want?" Clark asked. "Besides killing Confederates, which you've been doing effectively." "I want to keep my people alive until this war ends," Jake said. "I want the Union to win, and I want those who enslaved us to pay for what they did." Clark nodded slowly. "The first two I can help with. The last one is more complicated. But I can give you official status as a Union scout. You'd report to me, provide intelligence and tactical support, and in return, you and your people would have the Army's protection." Jake thought carefully. Official status meant visibility, which brought risks, but also meant access to resources, legitimacy, and protection under military law. "What happens after the war?" he asked. "I don't know exactly," Clark admitted. "But Lincoln's emancipation is coming. Slavery will end one way or another. Better to be on the winning side." Jake extended his hand. Clark shook it. The swamp insurgency had just become an official Union operation. Vicksburg fell on July 4, 1863, after a 47-day siege that starved the city into surrender. The Confederate garrison gave up, granting the Union full control of the Mississippi River and splitting the Confederacy. Jake's intelligence had played a major role. His scouts provided information about Confederate supply lines and weak points that Grant's staff used to plan attacks. After the surrender, Jake and his corps group were formally mustered as Union scouts attached to the 15th Corps. They wore Union blue, carried Army rifles, and operated with federal authority. This role gave Jake access to Confederate prisoner records. He searched carefully through rosters for specific names. He found Marcus Thornton, captured during the siege and held with 3,000 other Confederate soldiers awaiting parole or exchange. Jake got permission to question prisoners about conditions on Mississippi plantations. On a Tuesday morning in late July, he brought Marcus out of the camp. They sat across a rough wooden table in an empty warehouse. Marcus looked thinner, tired, but his eyes still held the arrogance Jake remembered. "So the runner became a soldier," Marcus said. "I always knew you were dangerous." "You made me dangerous," Jake replied. "Your hunts taught me everything I needed. You trained me better than you realized." Marcus laughed bitterly. "And now you're here to gloat?" "No," Jake said. "I'm here to make sure you understand something. Everything your family built was stolen from people. My life, the lives of everyone who worked your fields. You thought you could do it forever without consequence. You were wrong. Want revenge? Kill me. Won't change anything. The South might rise again after this war, but that's not my fight." Jake continued. "I'm not going to kill you. The Union will parole you eventually. You'll go home to a plantation that doesn't exist. Your father's dead, died when a Union shell hit your house. Your property is gone. Everything you owned is gone. You'll spend your life poor, powerless, knowing the man you hunted is the reason you lost everything. That's my revenge." Marcus finally understood. "You planned this, all of it." "No," Jake said calmly. "I survived, I adapted, I waited, and when the opportunity came, I took it." He stood. "I don't need to kill you, Marcus. History already did." Jake left the warehouse and never saw Marcus Thornton again. Records show Marcus was paroled in 1864, returned to Warren County, and died in 1868 from illness. The Thornton plantation was divided among freedmen during Reconstruction. Jake continued as a Union scout until the war ended in April 1865. He took part in Sherman's Meridian Campaign, provided intelligence across Mississippi and Alabama, and trained other former slaves in reconnaissance and guerrilla tactics. His reputation spread throughout the Union Army. Black Mamba was no longer a myth or ghost story, but a real soldier whose skill changed the outcomes of battles. Union officers respected him. Confederate survivors feared him. Enslaved people saw proof that resistance was possible. After the war, Jake had a choice: remain in the Army, possibly joining the Buffalo Soldiers, or settle down. He chose settlement. Under the Homestead Act and special freedmen provisions, he claimed 60 acres in Warren County, once part of the Thornton plantation. He built a house, planted crops, and married Esther, the woman who helped him survive those early years. They had 4 children, but life was not entirely peaceful. Reconstruction brought danger. White Southerners, angry over defeat, formed groups to restore white supremacy through terror. The Ku Klux Klan operated openly in parts of Mississippi, burning homes, killing freedmen, and intimidating voters. Jake's fame made him a target. Klan members approached his property twice in 1867, but both times they retreated after encountering clever defenses and reminders of Jake's swamp skills. Word spread. Black Mamba's land was off limits unless you wanted to end up face down in the black water. Jake lived on that land for 38 years. He raised his children, taught them reading, writing, and survival skills, and shared stories about Africa, the parts he remembered. He taught tracking, self-defense, and practical survival, though he never revealed everything he did during the war. Some stories were better left as legend. He died in 1903, aged 71, surrounded by family. His obituary in the Vicksburg newspaper was brief: Jacob Thornton, veteran of the Union Army, died at home Tuesday, survived by his wife and 4 children. It mentioned nothing of Black Mamba, the hunts, the resistance, or the fear he inspired. Those stories lived in oral tradition, passed down among black families who remembered one man standing up to an entire system and winning. The land Jake claimed in Warren County remains with his descendants. The original house burned in 1947, but its foundation survives, weathered by a century of Mississippi floods and storms. Local historians have traced military records, pension papers, and scattered Army reports. They confirm the broad outline: an enslaved man named Jake became a Union scout, fought in major campaigns, and settled as a freedman. But the details, the 19 hunts, the swamp resistance, the tracker dogs, exist only in oral tradition and Confederate reports, too embarrassed to admit the damage he caused. The legend persists because it matters. It shows that the enslaved, the people, didn't wait quietly for freedom. They struggled for it, using every tool they could find: silence, clever plans, and even violence when it was necessary. They turned the land itself into a weapon. They studied their oppressors' weaknesses and used them without mercy. And sometimes, when luck and circumstance met, they actually won. On sticky summer nights in Warren County, when the fog rises from the Big Black River and the world around you almost disappears, local people still share stories about something moving through the swamps. Most think of it as just folklore, one of those ghost tales that every community seems to create over time. But the descendants of the enslaved people who worked those plantations know a different truth. They know that Black Mamba was real. They understand what he stood for. And they recognize that some legends survive because they carry truths that are too important to ever be forgotten. The cottonmouth glides quietly through the dark waters, unseen but always present, and history, in its own way, remembers everything. Subscribe if you want to follow the next deep exploration.